She doesn't run anything. Let her eat with the staff. My brother's wife said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. My parents sat in silence. My brother smirked. I felt the burn of every eye on me, but I didn't flinch. I pulled out my phone, said 4 words, and watched their empire collapse. Cancel the contract. 45 million vanished in a heartbeat. My brother froze. My mother's face drained of color. The bride stopped breathing. I stood, walked away from that table, and left them with nothing but the wreckage they created. I'm Evan Mercer, and this is my truth. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love hearing how far my story can reach. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now let me tell you everything. And if my story resonates with you, please take a second to subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and it helps me keep sharing pieces of my life that I once thought I'd carry in silence. Boston rain clung to the windows of the Fairmont Copley Plaza that night, a misty curtain framing the chandeliers and the tulips scattered across tables dressed in white. The banquet hall glowed with a strange mixture of grandeur and pretense. Red tulips and expensive California wine, an indie band humming a cover of the Lumineers in the background. I sat where Alyssa Grant had placed me at the table near the swinging kitchen doors, where the smell of grilled salmon rolled in waves, and the chair beneath me rocked unevenly on one leg. The server leaned down once, whispering an apology. "Sorry, sir." The seating chart came from above. I gave a half smile. I already knew. Connor Hale stood under the chandelier, holding a glass of wine, his face flushed with the arrogance of being both groom and CEO. He was talking about the anti-fraud AI system that had saved Aurora Dynamics 3 years ago. He didn't mention that the system had been written in a basement by me 4 years before that. He didn't mention the endless nights I spent rewriting its code. He never did, and I never corrected him. Victor Grant sat beside Linda Hale, my mother, his expression calculated eyes sharp behind the rim of his glass. He wasn't a father-in-law to be celebrating love. He was an investor assessing a balance sheet, calculating whether Aurora was still worth the gamble. And then Alyssa's voice cut through the music. "He doesn't run anything. Let him eat with the staff." She didn't even lower her tone. Laughter flickered nervously around the table like a fire catching on damp wood. My mother shifted in her chair, pretending not to hear. Connor pressed his lips into a thin line, but he didn't stop her. I stared into the dark coffee I had ordered instead of wine, steam curling like smoke, reminding me of every time I had chosen clarity over intoxication. My mind moved faster than the music calculating. That $45 million contract between Aurora Dynamics and my companies. My network under Hale Ventures wasn't just a deal. It was their lifeline. The only thing holding together Baku, Thonco, and NA. If I pulled it, the dominoes would fall one after another. Unstoppable. I touched the earpiece at my collar. My voice was calm, almost casual. Cancel the contract. 4 words, a keystroke that activated the withdrawal clause I had buried in the appendix years ago. Almost immediately, Victor Grant's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening, then muttered one word under his breath. Amateurs. Connor Hale froze mid-toast. Alyssa's smile cracked. My mother's face drained of color. I set my coffee cup down, rose from that wobbling chair by the kitchen, and walked away. I left them with the applause fading into silence. I left them with the empire they thought they had built now collapsing because of a single sentence I chose to speak. But that was only the beginning. They thought I was harmless, the quiet shadow at their table. They had no idea how long I had been preparing for that moment, how many escape hatches I had built while they ignored me. My silence had never been weakness. It had been strategy. And every empire I built in the dark was about to come into light. As I stepped out into the drizzle that night, the sound of Alyssa's words still stinging my mind carried me back to a different rain, a different humiliation. I was 13, riding my bike home from the state programming competition, a trophy digging into my ribs through my backpack. The rain soaked me through cold and heavy, while across town my parents were cheering at Connor's football game. They didn't notice my absence. They didn't notice my win. At dinner, the trophy gleamed on the counter, but their plates were already cleared, their attention spent elsewhere. I had learned young silence was cheaper than acknowledgement. My father, Arthur Hale, was the exception. His office always smelled faintly of cedar and ink, the shelves crowded with books on systems architecture and business. He wasn't a man of many words, but one night he slipped a folded note across his desk to me. In his handwriting it read, "Never let your work depend on another man's kindness." He died not long after leaving me a sealed envelope and a small brass key to a safe deposit box. On the envelope, open only when you have your own foundation. I didn't open it, not then. High school was a blur of accusations and erasers. When Connor skipped classes, it was somehow my fault. Even if I was 100 miles away at coding camp in our house, the truth never beat the narrative. Linda's lectures always ended the same. Don't embarrass the family. Just sign what needs to be signed. So I signed and I stayed quiet, but in the basement, I was anything but silent. Night after night, while rain tapped against the narrow windows, I built the prototype of what would become Nexus, Weave, a data management system that could track patterns, flag risks, and weave information together like threads in a web. It was crude at first, but alive with possibility. I named it for the myth for the spider that wove something impossible. Years later, when Aurora Dynamics teetered on collapse during its first startup phase, I was the one who kept it alive. I patched a fraud scheme their accountant had buried, renegotiated a deal in Cambridge that no one else could save, and rewrote the inventory core that was bleeding cash. Connor's interviews ran. Connor's face landed on TechCrunch. I let him. And in the shadows, I drew up the licensing contracts Aurora could use my code, but only for a limited term. A quiet safeguard they never bothered to read. By then I had grown used to trading wine for coffee at family events. It was my private ritual, a signal to myself not to get intoxicated by their theater. I wrote down every slight, every error, every promise broken in a risk journal. Patterns formed, and then came the email. Alyssa sent it by mistake, copied to me instead of Victor. Once he signs, we're done babysitting him. He's nobody. I read it twice. I didn't rage. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to my attorney with one line. "This changes everything." And it did. That email became the first crack in the mask proof of their plan to erase me once they had secured my signature. It confirmed what the rain-soaked years had already taught me. Silence only mattered if I chose when to break it. That night at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, when I pulled out my phone, I wasn't just canceling a contract. I was answering every storm I had swallowed since childhood. And I knew it was only the beginning of what I was meant to unravel. The morning after the wedding, I sat in my office high above downtown Boston Harbor, stretching gray and endless beyond the window, the Prudential Tower rising through the drizzle like a sentinel. The air inside was spare and uncluttered, reclaimed wood desk, steel shelves, a single mug of coffee sending up quiet steam. No plaques on the wall, no photographs for the press. This wasn't an office meant for show. It was a control room, the center of a web invisible to those who had mocked me the night before. Hale Capital LLC was the shell, clean and anonymous. But beneath it sprawled the network I had built for years. Each thread was a company, each company a node feeding back into the system I had designed. Nina and Ethan, the bright-eyed founders who had taken NexusFi, my financial risk module, and molded it into a safeguard for banks across the coast. Avery, working with city officials to model housing demand, their numbers preventing another wave of displacement. Marcus, a logistics pioneer with fleets of electric vans. his roots powered by the algorithms I had written in a basement while my family slept. Sophia, soft-spoken but relentless, offering microloans to fishing communities whose names would never make it to Forbes, their repayment streams tracked by my code. Aurora Dynamics thought the $45 million contract made them indispensable to me. In truth, they were only one more client. Worse than that, they were the only client bound by a clause they never noticed an appendix that gave me unilateral power to withdraw if their leadership acted in ways that violated ethical standards. They signed it without question, drunk on their own arrogance. That clause was what I had invoked at the wedding when Alyssa sneered and my mother looked away. Every module, every algorithm critical to Aurora's operations was copyrighted under my name or held through a subsidiary. Their right to use was timed conditional and never exclusive. They had grown comfortable living off my silence, never realizing the ground beneath them was leased, not owned. I knew Victor never truly trusted them. He wasn't moved by family loyalty or pride. He tracked debt ratios, debt service, coverage, liquidity. For him, Aurora's deal with me was nothing but a certificate of credibility, a signal to the banks that cash would keep flowing. When I canceled, I wasn't just pulling my support. I had yanked the collateral from beneath Victor's calculations. The leverage crumbled instantly. A week before the wedding, I had tested the model. I ran a quiet simulation with Nina and Ethan, asking what might happen if Aurora's access were restricted. Within 12 days, their liquidity dropped by 22%. Within 6 weeks, 55% of their stability was gone. The result had glowed red across my risk dashboard. And so I had walked into the Fairmont Copley Plaza already knowing what a single command could do. This wasn't revenge. I told myself that again as I scrolled through data streams. It was about protection. If Aurora collapsed under the weight of its deceit, it could not drag my network with it. Every founder I backed carried communities on their shoulders. They couldn't afford to be collateral damage to my family's vanity. Still, as I leaned back in that chair by the window, I thought of my father's sealed envelope, the one I had finally opened in the quiet after the wedding. Inside was a legal memorandum signed and dated transferring authorship of Nexus Weave's original code to me. More than that, it included one condition. If Aurora ever used it to harm a partner or community, the rights would automatically revert to me fully and irrevocably. My father had built me a wall of fire years before I knew I would need it. I closed my eyes, coffee cooling in my hand, and felt the hum of the city below. Aurora Dynamics would not go quietly. Connor and Alyssa would not accept humiliation. The question was not if they would strike back, but how. And when they did, would I reveal everything, or would I keep some secrets buried to protect myself from the fallout of my own past choices? The storm came faster than even I expected. By dawn, my phone buzzed with alerts. TechCrunch ran the headline in bold, Evan Mercer sabotages $45 million Aurora deal. The article, fed by an unnamed source I knew too well, painted me as volatile, vindictive, a threat to the startup ecosystem of Boston. They called me bitter, accused me of torching the city's trust for personal spite. By noon, cameras were flashing on Alyssa and Connor. They stood behind a podium, flawless smiles masking the tremor in their voices. "We did everything as a family," Alyssa declared, her hand clasping Connor as though that would steady him. "But sometimes one person chooses betrayal." Connor nodded beside her, pretending conviction he didn't have. Behind them, Linda played her part perfectly. Her expression, pained eyes damp. A mother broken by a son who had abandoned blood. It was theater, a play for sympathy, and Boston was the audience. The legal strike followed hours later. Aurora's attorneys delivered a letter accusing me of malicious contract withdrawal. They threatened damages, courtrooms, public humiliation. I read it calmly at my desk, then opened the memorandum from my father once again. Every clause was there, every safeguard. I was untouchable, shielded by his foresight and my patience. That night, while the city dripped with rain, I received a call from a reporter who wasn't interested in spectacle. He had documents records that Connor had used Nexus Weave to patch holes in Aurora's accounts, disguising financial shortfalls with my software. He wanted to publish. He wanted me to confirm. The files lay open on my screen long after the call ended. My brother's fingerprints were everywhere. His recklessness coded into logs he thought no one would find. If I gave these to the press, Aurora would implode by morning. Investors would flee. Regulators would swarm. It would be the end of everything they pretended to be. But in those logs was also my silence, my complicity. For years, I had known Connor was leaning on my system in ways it wasn't designed to be used. I had told myself he would adjust, that I could look away, that my distance absolved me. If this came out, it wouldn't just be Connor exposed. My name would be tied to every cover-up, every concealed shortfall. The rain thickened against the glass as I stared down at the screen. They wanted to destroy me with narratives. I had the power to destroy them with truth, but truth was never clean, never without cost. Was I willing to bring down Aurora Dynamics by tearing open every secret, knowing I might burn with them? Or would I hold back, let them continue their theater and preserve the fragile distance I had built? The city below flickered with lights, each window glowing like a question. I pressed my hand against the glass, the cold seeping through my palm, and wondered how many storms one man could endure before silence was no longer protection, but prison. The first calls came from Marcus. His voice was tight-strained, nothing like the confident tone he carried when showing off his green fleets of electric vans. They pulled the plug, he said, anger barely contained. Aurora had canceled the logistics contract overnight, stranding hundreds of vehicles in depots across the region. His drivers were demanding answers, his investors breathing down his neck. To them, it wasn't Aurora's betrayal. It was mine. "You started this, Domino," Evan Marcus spat before cutting the call short. I stared at my screen long after the line went dead, watching the ripple hit his balance sheet, then spread outward through my network like a fracture across glass. Hours later, it was Avery. Their housing project depended on bridge financing tied indirectly to Aurora. Without it, entire complexes sat unfinished, foundations poured, but roofs left open to the rain. I went in person to the community hall facing tenants and families who gathered with folded arms and weary eyes. Some accused me outright of playing games with livelihoods. Others begged me to fix it, to somehow turn water into homes before the funding dried up. I could see the fear in their faces. People one paycheck away from losing everything. I promised nothing. I wasn't certain I could deliver, but I walked out carrying the weight of each plea like stones in my chest. Meanwhile, Nina and Ethan, whose code I had nurtured as carefully as my own, received an offer. Aurora came directly to them, bypassing me, dangling capital and exposure in exchange for loyalty. They sat across from me in my office, eyes shifting with unease. "They're offering us independence," Ethan admitted, his voice low. Independence was a polite word for betrayal. I listened in silence, not pleading, not bargaining. The real test was never loyalty when things were easy. It was loyalty when the storm came. But the strike that cut deepest came from Alyssa. She had reached Sophia, the quietest and most principled of my founders, with the promise of a financial package larger than anything she had ever seen. In return, Alyssa wanted her to accuse me of coercion, of forcing microfinance clients into terms they never agreed to. When I confronted Sophia, she looked at me with trembling eyes, shame evident. "I couldn't do it," she said, sliding a recorder across the table. On it, Alyssa's voice was sharp and cold. "We need to make Evan untrustworthy to Boston. Once his name is mud, everything else collapses." I played that recording again and again that night, the words burning into me. My network wasn't invincible. Every strand was a human being vulnerable to pressure, to temptation, to fear. My empire wasn't steel. It was silk. Strong only if every thread held together. As if the storm wasn't enough, my attorney arrived carrying a folder that made the room feel suddenly smaller. It was a copy of my father's supplemental will, one I had never seen. Inside, his signature and seal confirmed what Linda and Connor had buried. I held veto power inside Aurora Dynamics. Legally, I had been given the right to override any decision of its board. They had hidden it, convinced I would never dig deep enough to find it. And now, here it was, undeniable. It changed everything. I was no longer simply a supplier with leverage. I had legal authority to dismantle Aurora from the inside. My father had trusted me with the final safeguard, and my family had stolen it. They had silenced me for years, pretending I was irrelevant while hiding the fact that I was the one person with the power to undo them. The weight of that discovery pressed down on me. With a single move, I could end the company my father built and my brother corrupted. But to play that card meant war not just against Aurora, but against my blood. And the question settled heavier than any contract or clause: could I defend the web I had built without becoming the executioner of my own family? No. 9. Park glowed like a jewel against the waters of the Charles River, its windows framing the city lights, while plates of salmon arrived at tables with practiced elegance. My family chose it for reconciliation, but every step into that room told me it was an ambush dressed as dinner. The air was thick with pretense, the scent of grilled fish mingling with something colder, sharper, the anticipation of knives waiting to be drawn. Linda began with a tone of weary grace, her hands folded as though in prayer. Evan Boston doesn't need another scandal. Sign the reconciliation, return the contract, and this can all end quietly. Her voice trembled, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. It wasn't a plea, it was pressure. Connor, already drunk, leaned too far back in his chair, laughing louder than the conversation required. He boasted of adjusting reports to keep shareholders calm, bragging about manipulating numbers like it was clever strategy rather than fraud. I didn't interrupt. I only filed the admission away, another piece of ammunition should I decide to use it. Across the table, Victor swirled his glass, unimpressed. "This company is a house of cards," he muttered loud enough for all of us to hear. It wasn't a warning, it was a verdict. He was already preparing to walk away, his capital ready to move the moment the facade collapsed. Then Alyssa moved. She slid a folder across the table, her smile as sharp as glass. Inside lay a contract transferring intellectual rights of Nexus Weave to Aurora Dynamics, stamped with a signature that bore my name. But I knew that line of ink. It was copied, lifted from an old lease agreement. A forgery clumsy enough that anyone who looked too closely would see the fraud. Still, she leaned forward with a glint in her eye, certain the image of proof would be enough to sway perception, if not the law. Before I could respond, one of Aurora's attorneys announced with solemn authority that they possessed evidence I had embezzled funds through Hale. Data manipulated reports, twisted, but if released, the narrative could drown me before I could correct it. It was a dirty move, the kind of attack meant not to win in court, but to bleed me dry in the court of public opinion. My phone buzzed beneath the table. A message from the investigative journalist. The email archive between Alyssa and Victor had been authenticated. Her plan to erase me, her contempt in black and white. All they needed was my word, and by morning, Boston would know the truth. Later that night, I unlocked the second safety deposit box my father had left behind. Inside was not paper, not contracts, but a recording, his voice weary yet resolute. "If Aurora ever betrays the community, use my name to end it. Do not hesitate." Hearing him speak those words, after so many years, felt like a hand on my shoulder steadying me at the edge of the storm. I sat there at number 9 Park, surrounded by polished wood and flickering candlelight, realizing the lines had been drawn. No more gray areas, no more hiding behind silence. They would bury me with lies if I allowed it. The choice was mine. Expose them fully and watch Aurora collapse under the weight of truth, or hold back to protect the fragile balance of my own empire. The water outside shimmered with the reflections of the city. each light a question I could not yet answer. Was I ready to let go of the last ties of blood, even if it meant watching the empire my father once dreamed of reduced to ash? Or would I let them hold me hostage one more time, hoping silence could still shield me? The knives had been unscathed. Now it was only a matter of who would strike first. I left Number 9 Park, knowing there was no middle ground left. The city was washed in rain reflections, stretching long across the pavement. And for the first time in years, I didn't hesitate. I nodded once to the journalist who had been waiting for my word. By the time I reached my office, the headline was already alive on every screen. Leaked emails, Aurora's plan to erase Evan Mercer and manipulate investors. The words burned bright against the dark Boston night. The evidence was undeniable. Alyssa's email to Victor, arrogant and careless, read in black and white. Once he signs we're done babysitting him, he's nobody. There was no spinning those words. No denial could erase the contempt. They had built their power on pretending I didn't exist. And in one careless sentence, she had revealed the truth. Then came my father's voice. The law firm released the video he had recorded years before, his face lined with age, but steady. If Aurora betrays the community, end it. You, Evan, hold the veto. Use it if you must. The room went silent as I watched him speak as if he were in the chair across from me again. It wasn't anger in his tone, but conviction. He had left me a responsibility, not a weapon. I called an emergency meeting with every founder tied to Hale Ventures. Their faces filled the screen one by one. Nina, Ethan, Avery, Marcus, Sophia. I told them about the contingency funds I had kept hidden, about contracts that guaranteed their projects could withstand the storm. I showed them the clauses I had written years ago, transparent for the first time. My voice did not rise, but it carried the weight of certainty. When I finished, there was no hesitation. One by one, they pledged to stay. The web held. The fallout was immediate. Victor Grant stepped in front of cameras before dawn, cold and clinical. His words sharper than any courtroom blow. "Connor Hale is an amateur," he said, pulling his capital with a single sentence. CNBC carried the news within the hour. Aurora's stock plummeted in real time. Linda tried her final performance, rushing to schedule a press conference to deny everything. But the journalist had already published the supplemental will, the one she had kept hidden, showing the veto power my father had entrusted to me. The lie collapsed, and with it, the last shred of her credibility. Alyssa flailed. She tried to resurrect the forged contract with my false signature waving it before cameras, as if paper could change reality. Within minutes, analysts confirmed the forgery. It was a hollow gesture, transparent to anyone who looked closely, and Connor broke completely on live television. His voice cracked as he turned on his own mother, accusing her of betrayal, shouting that Alyssa had destroyed him. They tore each other apart under the spotlight they had once fought so hard to control. Aurora wasn't just unraveling financially, it was collapsing from within, its leaders cannibalizing themselves in front of the entire city. I watched from my office, rain streaking down the glass, the skyline glowing with headlines. For the first time, I felt the silence inside me shift. Not emptiness, not rage, something colder, and yet freeing. Aurora dynamics had fallen, and I hadn't needed to shout. One nod, one release of truth, and the weight of their lies crushed them from the inside. But as the cameras replayed Connor's face and Linda's pleas, a question rooted deep in me. Could I truly walk away untouched? Could I leave without glancing back at the wreckage of a family, however broken, that had once been mine? The answer lingered like the rain, uncertain, unspoken. The weeks that followed felt like years compressed into days. Aurora filed for bankruptcy. Its halls emptied, its name reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Partners fled banks, pulled credit lines, and the empire my brother flaunted at his wedding crumbled into dust. Connor disappeared from the headlines, then reappeared only as ridicule. his downfall dissected with cruel fascination. Alyssa's name became synonymous with fraud, her ambition immortalized in mockery. Linda reached out in messages that came one after another, her words dripping with desperation. "Don't end the family. Please, Evan, don't let this be the end of us." I read them once, then placed the phone face down. I had drawn the line, and I could not move it again. Some debts were never meant to be repaid. While Aurora collapsed, I unveiled Hale Ventures to the public. No more shadows, no more anonymity. The tower overlooking Boston Harbor that had once been invisible became the banner of a new empire. At the press conference, I stood with the founders at my side. Avery speaking passionately about affordable housing, Marcus describing clean logistics, Nina and Ethan detailing safeguards for banks, Sophia speaking quietly but firmly about the fishermen she fought for. Together they told the story I had always wanted told, not about me but about what silence had protected long enough to grow. When the cameras turned to me, I raised a cup of coffee instead of wine, letting the steam curl in the air. A small gesture, but one that carried everything. I wasn't there to gloat or to celebrate revenge. I was there to prove that clarity, patience, and restraint had been my shield, that my silence had not been weakness, but discipline. On the day Aurora's bankruptcy was finalized, my father's final letter was unsealed. Addressed to his attorney, it carried a single line: "Evan will not need this family to succeed, but this family will one day need Evan when they fall." Reading it, I felt no triumph, no bitterness, only the quiet weight of a prophecy fulfilled. And then came the invitation. A global growth fund offering to partner with me to take Hale beyond Boston across oceans into markets where our work could scale into something far greater. The doors I had once been locked out of now stood open, waiting. I walked out onto the balcony of the tower that night, rain misting the air, the city alive below me. For the first time, the silence wasn't a cage. It was freedom. My father's words echoed back through the years. "Never let your work depend on another man's kindness." I whispered them to the night not as a warning anymore, but as a legacy. The rain fell steady and unrelenting, and I stood at the summit, not because I had shouted louder than anyone else, but because I had waited, endured, and chosen the moment when silence spoke louder than any voice. Boston seemed quieter after Aurora Dynamics' collapsed, though I knew it wasn't the city that had changed. It was me. The headlines had shifted elsewhere. The chatter of investors moved on to new ventures. But inside the tower overlooking Boston Harbor, silence settled like a weight. I had won. Hale Ventures stood tall, my name now carved into the fabric of the city. No longer a shadow, but a force. Yet victory felt heavier than I imagined. Linda had left messages, some begging, some accusing, all unanswered. Connor had vanished from the public eye, retreating into whatever corners remained to him. Alyssa's face was plastered across news cycles not as a symbol of ambition, but of fraud. They were broken, but the breaking had broken something in me, too. I remembered nights as a boy sitting at the window watching rain streak down the glass while the house behind me filled with applause for Connor. I had wanted so desperately for my mother to turn to see me, to say I mattered. Even now, her silence echoed louder than all her later words. And when I chose not to answer her pleas, I felt both liberated and hollow. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. But survival leaves scars no headline ever writes. The founders stood by me. Avery called late one night, her voice steady. "You saved more than homes, Evan. You saved people who would have been forgotten." Marcus's fleet returned to the streets. Sophia's loans kept flowing to fishermen. Nina and Ethan doubled down on building safeguards for banks. They trusted me, and in their trust I found a strange solace. Still, in the quiet moments between calls and contracts, I felt the loneliness creep back. I walked through my father's office one evening, a room I had preserved more than lived in. The note he had once given me still sat framed on the desk. Never let your work depend on another man's kindness. I whispered it aloud, the words tasting of memory. He had been right, but he had also left me alone to live by that creed. My silence had been my shield, but it had also been my prison. And though I now stood free, the echo of solitude remained. The invitation from the Global Growth Fund came sooner than expected. They wanted Hale Ventures to expand into Asia, Europe, Latin America. They saw in me not the quiet son of a disregarded family, but a builder who had turned silence into an empire. I knew I could take it. I knew I could grow beyond Boston, beyond even the shadow of Aurora's ruins. The choice was mine, now no longer dictated by others. Yet, before I answered, I stood again on the balcony of my tower, the city lights shimmering across Boston Harbor, rain drifting steady and unrelenting. Boston had always spoken to me in rain. It was the sound of childhood disappointment, the rhythm of nights coding in the basement, the backdrop of my brother's lies and my mother's silence. And now it was the soundtrack of my ascension. I lifted a cup of coffee, not wine, letting the steam blur against the night. Cameras had once caught me doing the same, and now it had become a symbol others spoke about. But for me, it was still a reminder. Clarity over intoxication, patience over impulse. My father's final letter had said the family would one day need me when they fell. And they had, but I no longer needed them. What I needed now was to ensure that Hale's web outlasted me, that the empire I built didn't repeat the mistakes of Aurora driven by ego eaten from within. I wanted to leave a structure that endured because it served, not because it boasted. I thought of Linda, of Connor, even of Alyssa. Their downfall had been public, humiliating, final. My downfall, had it come, would have been quieter self-betrayal, silence turning inward until it devoured me. That was the fate I had escaped. As the rain streaked across the glass and the city hummed below, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not triumph, not vengeance, but the calm of knowing I had survived the storm and turned its weight into something unshakable. My silence had spoken. My legacy had begun. And when I finally picked up the pen to sign the Global Growth Fund's proposal, I knew I wasn't just building an empire. I was writing the final line of a story that had begun long ago in the shadows of a family that never saw me. Now the world did. In the end, I realized silence had never been my weakness. It was my weapon, my discipline, and the foundation of everything I built. Aurora's collapse wasn't just their downfall. It was proof that patience and truth outlast arrogance and lies. And though the scars remain, I stand knowing my father's words live on through me. If my story reached you, let me know in the comments. Say hi or where you're from. And don't forget to subscribe. And your support helps me keep sharing what once I thought I'd carry alone.